everyone. Welcome home. Thank you for joining me on this Wednesday. We have another very busy show for you, a great lineup of guests. Our starting point is Sierra Leone, my emotional home, where a lockdown ended just a few hours ago. We're going to take you live to the capital for a report on what's happening there. Also, a cause for concern. You're going to hear from the Central Africa Director from Human Rights Watch and learn why he is worried about conditions in that part of the continent. And as always, we'll have a doctor in the house, and we're going to be talking about the difference tech can make in this pandemic. And also, we'll be answering your questions. So get writing and send them my way. That and so much more just ahead. Let's get started. All right. Well, for weeks, Sierra Leone was on a very short list of African countries without any confirmed cases of the coronavirus. That suddenly changed last week, and now the country is reporting 7 confirmed cases. With that, the fact that this is a country that still bears the scars of its battle with Ebola, authorities moved quickly to impose a lockdown, which ended just a few hours ago. That lockdown lasted 3 days, which raised eyebrows amongst some. Let's get a sense of the situation there in the country and next steps. I'm pleased to say that journalist Umaru Fofana joins me now from Freetown. Umaru, can you hear me?
Hi, Aisha. Yes, I can hear you.
Hi, thank you so much for joining us again. So let's talk about the lockdown. You know, as you heard me say, Sierra Leone's lockdown was for 3 days. On average, most other lockdowns that we've seen have typically been 14 days and longer. It led many to question what could be achieved in such a short space of time. What are officials saying?
Well, the president held a press conference today, and he made 2 key points very clear. One, he said that there was no one-size-fits-all approach in responding to this pandemic. More or less saying that because some of the countries imposed a 2-week or 3-week lockdown, that wouldn't necessarily mean that Sierra Leone should do the same. He said that was one reason, but also the socioeconomic consequences, he said, of locking down people for 2 weeks in a country where more than 60% live on less than $1 a day would have a serious impact on people's lives and livelihood. So he said because of that, they thought of doing a 3-day lockdown. And he said that had actually been successful. He said, for example, what they had set out to achieve included trying to trace all the contacts, all those who had come into contact with all the 6 confirmed cases at the time. He said there was a 100% achievement of all of that. And then the secondary contact, that is those who came into contact with those who came into contact with the confirmed cases, 75% of them, he said, were tracked down. So basically, he said their aim was achieved, and that they were looking into the recommendations made by the commission set up to look into the whole COVID-19 response, and that the cabinet would come up with the next steps in that regard.
Okay, I just wanted to clarify something for our viewers and see whether the government addressed this point specifically, which is, of course, the science here, which is that our understanding is that this virus, as it were, not even as this virus, basically typically takes 14 days to manifest, for people to start to show symptoms, which is why by and large, most countries impose a 14-day at a minimum lockdown because they believe it's that amount of time before you can tell if someone has actually been infected. Did the government speak to the science? I mean, I get the economic problems, but, you know, the science is the science.
Well, he did not speak to the science, but some government officials have drawn parallel. They said that, for example, when Ebola was here in 2015, 14 and 15 and even 16, the incubation period for Ebola is 3 weeks. And then they argued that never at any point in time did the country lock down for 3 weeks, which was the incubation period at the time. They said that as far as they were able to track down those who had come into contact with the confirmed cases, that would about do it. And the fact that there has been no case yet reported outside Freetown, they said that meant that they ought not to put people through what they call, further economic hardship. And probably crucially, they have been saying that so far it's working because of the 7 confirmed cases, all 6 were registered and tested in quarantine, meaning the president argues that the system is working, and as a result of that, there is no need, they believe, to change the goalposts at this stage.
Sierra Leone now at 7 with this latest case that has been identified. The question has to be, what's the situation in the neighboring countries? You mentioned Ebola. When that became, our cross to bear, it also affected Liberia and Guinea. They have significantly more cases than we do in Sierra Leone. What's the situation in terms of their respective responses, and critically the borders, where we have seen in the past people pass back and forth?
Well, interestingly, both Sierra Leone and Guinea closed their borders a few days ago, and Liberia hasn't officially closed its borders as far as I know, but the fact that Sierra Leone has closed its own side of the border presupposes that the border is effectively closed. But such is a relationship between peoples of these countries that is going to be very difficult. And that's the question I put to the president today during the press conference, not least because the situations in Liberia and Guinea are far worse than that in Sierra Leone. For example, Liberia more than doubled its total confirmed cases today. Up to yesterday, it had only 14 cases. And today, that cumulative number has jumped to 31. And Guinea, in the last 1 week, has exponentially recorded more and more cases. So those concerns he said he had, and there are calls now for the regional body called the Mano River Union, which is a body of Sierra Leone, Liberia, Guinea, and La Côte d'Ivoire, that the MRU should step in now and try to do a coordinating role in trying to see how all these 4 countries can synergize their efforts and centralize their response, not least like what they did during the Ebola outbreak in Sierra Leone, Liberia, and Guinea. But so far, we haven't yet heard from the MRU as to how they plan to do that. But they say they plan to do that. And the president says it's a concern what is happening in the neighborhood. But, they can only ensure that they strengthen patrols along the borders with Guinea and Liberia, and hope that communities can help in trying to ensure that nobody crosses the border and comes into Sierra Leone from either Liberia or Guinea. And it has to be said, Aisha, that Ebola came into Sierra Leone through an unofficial crossing point from Guinea, whereby a sick patient was brought across the border for herbal treatment.
Yeah,
and that's how it snowballed into the rest of Sierra Leone.
Snowballed and decimated our healthcare system and claimed the lives of many, many people. You mentioned Côte d'Ivoire, Ivory Coast, is part of the Mano River Union. I want to talk about something that made headlines and see what more you can tell us about it. Widely reported, and I've seen pictures of locals burning a building that my understanding was to be used as a coronavirus testing center, but people in the community felt it would actually be, I guess, a quarantine site. Talk to me about what details are emerging and really how this underscores the fear that people have, fear that we've seen before, fear that, manifested and exploded during Ebola.
Well, yes, that attack took place in the Côte d'Ivoire, and it is not a new thing, so to speak, because even during the Ebola epidemic in this region, there were a lot of attacks, against healthcare workers, against healthcare facilities, in part because people feared, and they still do fear right now, that there are so many conspiracy theories that these people have come around to inject them with some blood to infect them with the coronavirus, and there's a 5D conspiracy theory creeping into the region. But also some people say it's because of the high level of ignorance, of illiteracy. It's very difficult to get some people to understand that this thing is real and it kills. The same way that it happened during Ebola, people just were in denial. And after the lockdown, for example, in Sierra Leone today, you could see people going about their normal business, even though there are some restrictions as to what they can do and how they can do that. But there is still that ignorance, there is still that denial in so many people who believe that all this thing is a conspiracy to bring some kind of, infection and infect the people of either Sierra Leone or Liberia or Guinea or La Côte d'Ivoire. And I wouldn't be surprised if the reason for that in La Côte d'Ivoire was that people thought that they were going to use, some injection to infect people in that country with the COVID-19 disease. It's a sad reality in this region. And during Ebola, for example, some people believed that if somebody died who was a knowledgeable person, if they washed them and drank the water, they would get wisdom. So it tells you about the chronic level, the endemic level of ignorance in this part of the world. And that's not going to make this fight any easier.
So, I wanted to ask you about the way forward when you're dealing with these kinds of conditions in terms of levels of understanding, hostility to science in some cases, and in other cases just a level of poor education. Are there lessons learned from how we communicated the Ebola messaging that we could apply here, or that would help us break through and bring about the change in community behavior, which is key to getting the situation under control?
I think there's a bit of a difference this time around. Initially, I mean, in 2014, when Ebola came, the messaging was awful. The authorities simply said, this is Ebola. If you get it, if you contract it, you will die. There's no cure. Therefore, go to the health center. And the question was, why would you go to the health center if we die anyway? Yeah. This time around, the messaging is a lot better organized. It's a lot better put. And people are being encouraged to wash, to kind of like wash their hands with soap and water, and ensure that if they feel sick, they call a toll-free number. And there are toll-free numbers in all countries in the Mano River Basin, Sierra Leone, Liberia, Guinea, and La Cote d'Ivoire. And the health workers would come and pick them up and take them to treatment centers. And if they do so early, they are being told, chances are very strong that they will get well. So that messaging is a lot better, a lot clearer this time around. But still, there is that deep sense of denial. People here mostly rely on herbal treatment. They go to their community, herbalists for them to get cure when they are ill. But also the issue of using communities, and that was one magic wand during the response against Ebola. They engaged with communities, ordinary people, local people who became the policemen to report on people whom they thought were sick and were not reporting themselves. And people are now calling for that kind of thing to be introduced. So take it down to the local level, let the people understand what this thing means, and let them engage themselves for better understanding of A, what it's like, and B, if they feel that way, how to respond to it.
Umaru, such great reporting, always such valuable insight. Thank you for being a friend of the show. We very much appreciate it, and we'll check in with you again soon. Thank you. Umaru Fofana there in Sierra Leone's capital, Freetown. Thank you. If you are just joining us, you are at home with Isha Sesay, and we've just been talking about situation in Sierra Leone, my home, where the country's just ended a 3-day lockdown, which authorities say was primarily focused on contact tracing individuals who'd come into contact with confirmed cases of coronavirus in the country. Now they're reporting 7 cases in that small West African nation. But the concern, of course, is that while Sierra Leone's numbers are small, the number of cases cropping up in neighboring Guinea and Liberia is much larger and surging much faster. And we have porous borders, and people are known to literally just hop from one country to the other. So the question has to be about getting those border areas locked down and secure. Also interesting to me in talking to Umaru Fofana, just this question of messaging. How do you communicate to a population of which significant numbers are poorly educated or naturally apprehensive about Westerners and foreign diseases? How do you communicate to them effectively so that you can bring about a change in behavior? And Umaru said a lesson learned from Ebola, which Sierra Leone, Guinea, and Liberia battled in 2013, 2014. The key there was community engagement. It was going down to the grassroots level, finding those community leaders who held sway in the local populace, who could bring about a more effective means of communication and bring about a change in community behavior. So, we're going to continue to watch the situation in Freetown, Sierra Leone, and bring that to you as and when we get more details and things are changing there. All right, from Sierra Leone now, we're going to hop across the continent, and I want to tell you about some startling but maybe not surprising news out of Burundi. The international organization Human Rights Watch is basically saying that authorities in that nation, that Central African nation, are preventing a number of aid organizations from providing assistance to Burundians and foreigners who have been quarantined in that country. And they're saying often they've been quarantined in unsanitary conditions. I spoke to Human Rights Watch's Central Africa Director, Mudge, to get more details on what exactly is happening there. Take a listen. And Lewis joins us now from Vermont. Lewis, thank you so much for making time to speak to me. You've sounded the alarm about the situation in Burundi specifically and the amount of access your Human Rights Watch colleagues have been able to gain to vulnerable populations there. Can you just set the scene for us and explain to us what you've been seeing, what you've been hearing on the ground?
Sure. Burundi is of utmost concern for us for a variety of reasons. Number one, they're moving into next month an election period. So there's going to be wide-ranging legislative and presidential elections from May to August of this year, and there's been no indication that they're going to reschedule those. On the contrary, they're plowing ahead with campaigning, which means you're going to have huge crowds of tens of thousands of people very, very soon congregating, and it's actually already happening now. But number two, there is an information deficit coming out of Bujumbura. Burundi is a country that up until 5 years ago was really seen as a bastion for free speech and for space for civil society in the region. But after a failed coup attempt in 2015 and a very controversial third term taken by the current president, Pierre Nkurunziza, the whole situation, the whole dynamic with regards to civil rights and civil liberties has changed. And so in just a very short period of time, there's been a complete crackdown. And what that translates into with regards to a situation like the COVID pandemic is that it's very hard for people to get information, for people to know what's actually happening. It's very hard for human rights monitors and humanitarians to know what's happening on the ground. So you have a lot of misinformation and, frankly, a lot of mistruths coming out from the government. For example, they're saying right now there's one quarantine site in the capital, Bujumbura, but we know that there's at least 11 around the country in which people are being held in unsanitary conditions, they're being crowded into rooms, and in many instances, they're being forced to pay. And there's one case in which folks out of one hotel in the interior of the country who haven't paid are then being taken to jail because they haven't been able to pay their hotel bill. So this is very, very troubling. It's very concerning for us. And this fact that this is all happening in this pre-electoral climate just raises the stakes.
Yeah, no doubt about that. People being forced to pay for any kind of quarantine. When you lay out the situation as you do, I've got to ask, clearly they've got these quarantine sites. Are they even testing? I mean, what do we know about testing and any kind of formulation of a response in the event of coronavirus spreading in the country?
So they've just announced just today in the last couple hours, they just announced that they've conducted their 35th or 36th test. So this is still, we're talking, a few dozen tests. This is a country of approximately 9 million people. And many of the people, especially in Bujumbura, in very, very tight conditions, living kind of in some of these neighborhoods and quartiers on top of each other. So we're talking early days. There's only they say there's only a few cases. But once again, it's very hard to know what actually is happening on the ground. This is a president and a cadre around him who insist that their foremost precaution is God, that they are going to be protected by God. And all religious rights and all folks, personal views on religion aside, it is worrying that when you have a pandemic, which is, you're supposed to be taking your advice from scientists and epidemiologists, that you're putting your faith in God and you're going to let God dictate how this is going to unfold.
And so for your teams on the ground, where does this leave you? I mean, talk to me about how, I know that there's been restriction on access to people in these unsanitary conditions. What's the plan now? Not to mention the fact that for groups like your own and any group working, in the field at a time like this, they themselves face an element of personal risk.
Yeah, absolutely. So we haven't been able, us as Human Rights Watch official staff haven't been able to access the country for a couple of years now. But we certainly have contacts on the ground who continue to help us. They do it at incredible risk, not only for the political aspects of it, because being associated with Human Rights Watch in a country like Burundi is, and I'm not being facetious, is a death sentence. So there's not only that aspect. So we have to be incredibly careful with these people being known as someone who's providing information to us. But now there's this whole new layer of traveling with a pandemic. So While Burundi, we consider the steps they've taken to be halting at best, and in many ways a crackdown on civil liberties, they have taken some steps, which does include trying to limit the amount of traffic outside of the election campaign period. And so it is hard for people to get into the interior of the country right now. So we're finding things to be incredibly difficult. Human rights work with this pandemic in general, our investigations have sort of gone, we've had to do it on WhatsApp. We obviously have to use applications like WhatsApp before, but now we're relying on it more and more. I'm speaking to you from Vermont. In a month before the elections in Burundi, in any other context, I'd be in Nairobi. But here I am.
So let me ask you this: what we're seeing in Burundi, which seems to be a kind of escalation, if you will, of a kind of erosion of or backsliding on democracy, which began some years ago. Yeah. Can you give me a general sense of as you look around Central Africa, because I know that's your beat, so to speak. Yeah. How concerned are you that this pandemic it creates an opportunity for the backsliding, if you will, when it comes to the democracy, the undermining of the pillars of democracy? What's giving you a cause for concern right now, or where are you focusing right now?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we are seeing this across the region broader. My colleagues are seeing this across the continent. And I think this is where groups like Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International do add value in trying to go broad picture and look at some of the democratic backsteps that are being taken in the response. So you've got the situation in Burundi, its neighbor to the north in Rwanda. Rwanda was one of the first countries to issue a countrywide lockdown. This is a country tightly controlled by Paul Kagame, who has very authoritarian tendencies. The Commonwealth Heads of Summit was due to take place in Rwanda later this year. It was a very big deal. That's obviously, while it hasn't been officially announced, it's going to be put on hold. But what you've seen a military response to the crackdown, to the lockdown in Rwanda. So you've seen heavy-handed tactics by the military with people who are violating it, especially people in some of the slum areas. And so we're already getting reports are coming out in the last week of cases of beatings and even cases of sexual violence, of rape against some of these poor women. So that's terribly concerning. If you go over to the Congo, massive country, the size of Western Europe, it has a new president in Félix Tshisekedi. He's only been running the country for about a year now, and he was basically put in place by the former president Joseph Kabila. He doesn't have huge consolidated power in the Congo, and so what we're seeing is an incredible amount of miscommunication and bad communication management coming out of Kinshasa. You're seeing false information being announced by the government only to be corrected a few hours later. You're seeing statements like, we're going to close down Kinshasa's Gombe, a massive neighborhood, tomorrow, and then they decide no, we'll do it in 3 days. So you see a rush on the shops, and prices all of a sudden triple over the course of a matter of hours, only to have nothing actually happen. And in Congo, I mean, while you do want to give Kinshasa credit that they are trying, in Congo, this miscommunication has to be seen in the context of the recent Ebola epidemic that was taking place in the East. And a lot of the problems that were linked to the control of Ebola had to do with mistrust of the government. And so we're very worried that these miscommunications that are already being put out by Kinshasa, the rumors that are going around on WhatsApp, and some of them actually stemming from official government communiques, are going to build this mistrust of government action. And this is a massive country, close to 70 million people, huge territory. And so they really do need to try their best to control the pandemic. If you go to a country like Central African Republic, we're terribly worried about what's happening there. This is a country with literally 3 ventilators in the entire country. This is a country that is conflict. It's not post-conflict. 80% of its territory is controlled by armed groups. You have 600 some odd thousand people living in IDP camps in a country of only 4.5 million. And so if the pandemic hits the CAR, in a serious way, you're looking at basically a central state that's not even pretending to have any capacity to deal with this. It really is going to be everyone for themselves. And then if you go to Cameroon, you have Paul Biya, who's been in power since the early 80s, very, very concerned with his own health. Rumor he hasn't said anything publicly.
No, not a
Rumors have
word.
it that
When was
he's
the
on
last time you heard
lockdown.
from Paul Beer?
Yeah, he's on lockdown and he's worried about his own health. You also have very, very few places that can actually do the tests. Cameroon actually has over 700 cases. It's the most
Right.
confirmed cases in the region. And Cameroon has one of the most overpopulated prison populations in Africa. So if and when COVID-19 does hit the prisons in Cameroon, it has the potential to be a real catastrophe.
I mean, if there's anyone watching this who is under any illusions and holding on to hope, what would you say in terms of basically what's at stake here as you look at the region?
I mean, look, I just got back from Kenya about 11 days ago, so I was kind of one of the last ones getting out. I know a lot of people are very concerned about Africa. It is incredibly worrying. But these are incredibly resilient communities and countries. These are people that have been through very, very difficult times, and they are used to getting through really, tough times and issues. So I am really worried. This is not cause to sort of kick back and relax and say, like, let Africa manage. No, absolutely. I think there needs to be more resources given. I think the global north needs to step up and provide some of these countries with some of the health assistance that they vitally need. It's shocking that you've got Cuomo here in New York City trying to get 8,000 ventilators, and you have a country like the CAR with 3. I mean, it's just shocking. But on the other hand, I will say that if there's any place that I feel can deal with it, these countries like the Congo, these countries like CAR, I do think they are more resilient in some ways than the Western countries because they've just had to be, because life has been that tough for some of them. There's also, I think, a lot of communities will be protected by their isolated status. I do think there's cause for hope because they shut down the flights into a country like the Central African Republic. They've shut down the borders. That if they can try to contain it in Bangui, there's real chance that it won't spread beyond the capital into the real country, the hinterlands of the country, saving potentially thousands of lives. If this does hit, there's a lot of underlying health issues in Africa, especially in the cities. So if this does hit the cities hard, and it has the same effect that we're seeing in a place like New York, it's almost, in some ways, it's too terrifying to contemplate. So I'm not trying to make light of it at all. But what I will say is my daily conversations with colleagues and with contacts, they do say, look, yes, this is serious. We are taking it serious, but we've had serious issues in the past, and we know what precautions to take. And we know what a lockdown feels like because we've done them before, obviously not in a COVID context, but we've done them in the past, and we will get through this. So I'm eternally optimistic about Africa. That's how I've been working on it for the last 20 years. But I do think that Central African countries will come through this, and there might be some lessons learned.
Yeah. Lewis Mudge, from one optimistic soul to another optimistic African, thank you so much for speaking to me. Really appreciate the insight and perspective.
Thank you so much for having me.
An important context there from Lewis Mudge. As always on the show, we've made it a priority to pause and acknowledge the lives lost to the coronavirus. We launched the show on March 26th, and then the number of coronavirus cases on the African continent was approaching 3,000. Here we are almost 2 weeks later, and now we're looking at close to 11,000 confirmed cases of coronavirus on the continent, and hundreds of people have lost their lives. Amongst them, former Libyan Prime Minister Mahmoud Jibril, who died of COVID-19 in Cairo this past Sunday, Jibril was the interim leader of the country after Gaddafi was ousted back in 2011. He headed Libya's National Transitional Council during the country's uprising. He was hospitalized for 2 weeks before he passed away. Mahmoud Jibril was 68 years old. Our thoughts and prayers go out to his family and so many people who are grieving, having lost loved ones in this pandemic. Okay. Now, parts of Nigeria, including its capital, Abuja, remain under lockdown as the authorities there in Africa's most populous nation try and halt the spread of coronavirus within its borders. At present, the country has more than 250 confirmed cases and is reporting 6 deaths. But like in many places around the world, not just in Africa, in many places around the world, the question is how widespread is testing? And the follow-on question from that is, do we really have a clear understanding of how widespread this virus is amongst the population? Well, joining me now from Johannesburg is Dr. Nneka Mobisson. I'm so pleased you could spend some time with me. She's a co-founder and CEO of MDoc Healthcare. That's a digital platform providing 24 access to nurses, virtual nurses, doctors, and healthcare providers. I also know that many of you have lots and lots of questions, so please send them so I can put them to Dr. Mobisson. Hello, welcome. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Hi, Aisha. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Your audio is beautiful. I'm sorry, broadcasting using tech. My heart is always in my mouth because I'm just like, when is it going to crash?
Honestly, and especially now, it's a lot worse now that all of us are using tech. So the issues are real.
Let me tell you, not only are we all online and talking about issues right now, we also have our neighbors around us all the time. Just before I went live on air, they were hammering above me in my apartment.
It's so true. Or your kids trying to help you get on Zoom for their online session or stream something. So I get it. It's
lot going on. Can you start by explaining to me and all our viewers how you are using tech in this moment to help impact the response to COVID-19?
Sure. So MDoc is a digital health social enterprise, essentially telehealth company that leverages data, behavioral science, quality improvement, and obviously tech to support people living with chronic health needs. So think pregnancy, think diabetes, cancer, high blood pressure, and also mental health needs. So depression, anxiety, to really support them in living healthier lives. So that's kind of who we are and who we were pre-COVID. Now, if you really look at the vulnerable populations in the COVID-19 pandemic, it's the people that we serve, right? So people who are living with chronic conditions such as high blood pressure, diabetes, cancer, etc., they're at much higher risk of severe complications from COVID, as well as pregnant women. Pregnant women have also been put into the more vulnerable population. So the very people that we serve using tech are the ones that are at greatest risk. So we essentially connect them with coaches, so coach-led care teams that support them virtually. They support them on lifestyle modifications, so nutrition, exercise, medication adherence, and a whole lot more. They also support them in navigating them when they need in-person care. So we built a Pan-African-wide directory of healthcare services, facilities, and providers. But because of COVID, we've actually layered on hotline numbers, isolation centers, testing sites, and treatment centers across Africa onto this existing directory so that we can essentially help people navigate where to go and when to go for care if they're worried that they are symptomatic or they meet the case definition of COVID in their respective countries. And then lastly, we do a lot of teleeducation. So our whole focus is how can we increase the likelihood that when someone goes for care, they get the right kind of care at the right time all the time. And so we leverage our teleeducation platforms to support, essentially train healthcare providers, so our doctors and nurses. We already did that, but now we completely ramped that up so that we're doing weekly teleeducation sessions for doctors and nurses. We just had one a few hours ago for healthcare workers across Africa, and we're now also doing it for people. So we've opened up a series where every Saturday we invite people to come and talk to us about what their challenges are, what their concerns are with COVID. Last Saturday it was on mental health and kind of coping strategies during this COVID time. The weekend before it was on pregnancy and COVID. So very much about ramping up teleconsultation and ramping up teleeducation across sub-Saharan Africa.
I mean, it's fantastic work. It's much needed. It's a much needed resource. But you know the question that I'm going to ask you, because I'm sure you've been asked it many times. It's a question of access. To access by the vulnerable and the poor. Given that Africa has pretty much a tiered healthcare system, right? Sure. Where the wealthy can get access and information, and the poor and the vulnerable on the margins struggle to get decent care. So talk to me about the take-up of this resource, of this kind of platform. How widespread is it in a place like Nigeria?
So we've always gotten that question. Day one, you talk about leveraging tech for health, and that's the first question. The next question that we meet with. The reality is our mobile phone penetrations are very high in Nigeria and in many African countries. So maybe not smartphone penetration rates, but basic phone. And so our whole premise is we meet you where you are. So in addition to our existing platform, we've integrated it with dual way SMS. We've integrated it with WhatsApp. We've integrated it with Telegram. Because if we're really about being person-centered, we have to essentially provide you the support that you need when you need it. And so if you look at our average essentially end user, they make less than $100 a month. Most will have gone to secondary school, but may not have completed secondary school. 75% of our population right now are women. And so our coaches are essentially trained to support people at different levels of literacy, etc. But it's a real issue. It's still, no matter what, it's an issue. We say, you can have a smartphone and only be comfortable using it for a call. Yeah. We have our average age of our population historically was 52. Now that we're serving a lot more pregnant women, that's coming down. But I think a 50-year-old is young. But a 50-year-old, a lot of our end users would say, okay, I'll have my child, enter information for me, but then I'll talk to the coach, but I want my child to enter my data or my information, which is fine, right? Because again, we understand we're a community-based society. Whether it doesn't matter where you are across this continent, we're very much focused on kind of our families and our communities. And so when we support you, we're working with your family to support you as well.
So let me ask you this: what does an intervention such as the one that MDoc is making, what does it mean for the allocation of scarce resources in a moment like this?
So if you look at our healthcare systems across Africa, we do not have the capacity. So most of our healthcare systems are weak. And the reason why you keep on hearing flatten the curve wherever it is, whatever country it is, whether it's the West or not, it's because we recognize our healthcare systems, our hospital systems are not capacitated and do not have the bed capacity. We don't have the healthcare worker supply to be able to support and manage patients at the height of this pandemic. And so MDoc essentially creates virtual capacity. We're using technology to add capacity to the system, but virtually. So what does that mean? It means we support people those who are unlikely to have COVID. We're keeping them out of the system, right? So people, for instance, pregnant women, a lot of the facilities in Nigeria are now extending their appointments. So they don't have to, instead of coming in 4 weeks, they come 8 weeks later. At MDoc, we're supporting them in being the in-between guide in between those ANC appointments, and helping them understand if they have specific symptoms, whether those are high risk or not, and whether they do need to go to the facility. At the same time, we're supporting people who are in self-isolation and who are feeling really anxious and worried about their symptoms, but who do not meet the criteria to go to the facility. So by doing that, and also the third piece is really helping people navigate, when to call the hotline, when to go to be tested, and further. And so by doing that, we're keeping them out of a system. We're reducing the likelihood that they're going to spread or that they're going to contract the infection, and therefore overburden an already overburdened healthcare system.
Doc, I can't let you go without asking very quickly your assessment, rather, of the response right now as it's playing out in Nigeria. What's working in your view, and where the challenges remain?
Sure. So I think the Federal Ministry of Health, the Lagos State Ministry of Health, the Nigeria CDC have really done a great job in terms of informing the public. I mean, real-time information is coming out, really driving awareness and trying to dispel the myths that are out there that social media is helping spread. They're now working with the private sector, which I think is incredible. The Lagos State Ministry of Health just announced today that they are working on accrediting our private healthcare facilities so that they are COVID ready. Why does that matter? If we have to follow the patients. We have to see that patients are more likely, potentially maybe more likely to go to a facility near to them, which may not be a public facility. So by having that public-private sector response, that's going to ensure that, one, we're driving up testing, we're driving up contact tracing, we're preventing people from actually acquiring COVID, and that we're essentially helping to manage people who do have COVID more efficiently and more effectively, thereby reducing deaths and reducing the serious complications. Of course, we can do more. We need to test more. I mean, there's no question, but I think the government has recognized that, and they're focusing on that now.
Oh, well, Dr. Nneka Mobisson, thank you for the work you're doing and for shining a light on the difference tech can make during this pandemic. Thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you for all you're doing. All right.
Thank you. Take care.
Bye.
I love getting these innovators on who are just showing how technology, how digital platforms, how apps are making a difference in this fight. Obviously, we all know about the limits of capacity on the continent and the fragility of our healthcare system. So we're going to have to innovate. We're going to have to find new solutions. We're going to have to do, telemedicine. We're going to have to use data in innovative ways that help us in Africa. I think the point we keep hearing is that it's not one size fits all, whether it's in the case of Sierra Leone at the beginning of the show, where authorities there are saying other countries may do 14 days as a lockdown, but, that's not that it doesn't work for us here. And, we're seeing in places like Nigeria and really right across the continent, this surge in the use of tech. And it's a real opportunity for African innovators to be at the table to help craft an African solution that helps our people, and one that takes into consideration our specific context, the specific conditions that we are dealing with. So, if you are regular on the show, you will continue to see us spotlight these innovators and really the great work that Africans are doing on the continent during this difficult time. All right, moving on. We're going to switch now to the bright side, because we are going to get through this. We're going to come together as communities, and we're going to lean on each other, and we will get to the end of this. Nobody can say when, but I think we can say with the certainty that this too shall pass. And to do so, we're going to need hope. We're going to need sources of inspiration. And so every day on this show, we bring you the bright side to help you with that. Today's bright side is a man considered to be the godfather of comedy in Nigeria. And he's got a wit. He's got a keen insight into what's happening there and around the world. So everybody, please welcome Ali Baba. Can you hear me? Oh, and then his picture did that weird thing that it does with tech. It just went. Ali Baba, can you hear me? Let's see if we can refresh his picture. You know, I like to tell you. Oh, are you there?
I'm here. I'm here. Yeah, I'm here. I don't have 5G yet, but I can still relate with you.
Listen, this 5G. What are you talking about 5G? About how 5G is the source of this coronavirus? What is wrong with people and all this false information?
I think we already have a gullible society that laps up any information that they get, and it then shapes their information. It shapes their thought processes, and you can't blame anyone for that. We only can blame social media because the amount of falsehood that is going out there, people just drum it up and just push it. It's not even about propaganda now. It's what people believe. And your mind must be in a state of believability for such information to come to you, and you take it hook, line, and sinker.
You know, you talk about your mind must be in a state of gullibility to accept this. I mean, you have been using social media, and recently you said you called out, you know, the religious folk, the pastors in your country, and said, you know, telling people do not be listening to what these people are saying. Tell us more, and more importantly, have you been near a church since you said that? Ooh, we're having audio trouble. Let's see.
Hello.
Okay, we hear you. So you were saying?
Me now?
Yes, we're hearing you now.
Okay. So the church that I attend has online services, so we can do our online services without going out of the house. But that said, it is that I had to pick on churches, especially the pastors and religious leaders who were telling people that it was okay to go out, that there was nothing this pandemic can cause, there was nothing Corona can do to them. You're giving people a false sense of hope. You're making them believe that it is nothing to worry about. And when you give them that sense of hope, they can then go out and flout the orders of the government. And so I had to come against that. Because I said, if, for instance, a pastor says you should go out, you see, there's a difference between reality and spirituality. There's a difference between reality and spirituality. You don't wake up in the morning, lie in your bed, and as you're laid down in your bed, you then say, God, come give me a bath. You do not say, God, come give me, bring my shoes, bring my clothes, let me wear them, I need to go out. You get up and do that. That's the aspect of free will. That's the reality. So you must get up to do some things for yourself. You see, some of these pastors make them believe, not to think about, they just want them to put everything in the corridors of spirituality, and that is a big problem. And so I had to mention that this coronavirus is not a joke at all. It is not something a pastor is wishing away. Now, where are all the pastors that normally do the touch you, you get healed, and everything is okay? Where are the pastors? Go to the centers where they have this coronavirus people and heal them. So what we're saying is, God himself has said in different places in the Bible that when you have issues like this, stay indoors until it is resolved. Beyond that, God himself has said, for everything that we do, we should get wisdom. And from getting that wisdom, we should get understanding. You see, my first degree is in religious studies and philosophy.
Okay, and so this is your sweet spot.
So I understand the Hebrew. The Hebrew. I read Hebrew. I read Greek, and did a bit of Arabic just to study the religions, the major religions at the time in school. And so I understand the philosophy behind some of these things that these pastors preach. And my point is, when it gets to this, for instance, if you're walking on the road and the car loses direction and is coming at you, you don't stand in that place and begin to pray and cast and bind. You run for safety.
And so
that's the point.
You do what you have to do. Exactly. You don't just stand there. You don't just stand there in the way.
You don't stand there.
Free will.
And so that is the point that I've been making on my online platforms. I've been saying this virus is deadly, this virus is dangerous, and the people should know that there's a difference between reality and spirituality.
And
get
so,
to a point where you can say.
So, and I didn't mean to cut you off. This small delay. So, as you use your platform to make these important points, which are necessary and need to be heard by the masses, how important is comedy in a moment like this and the ability to laugh at a time like this?
At a time like this, you have to make light of some of the issues. But there's a very thin line. At times like this, there's a very thin line between being funny and being offensive. Mm-hmm. And so you have to take into cognizance the people who are in the front line, the nurses, the health workers who are in the front line. You also have to take into cognizance the people who are losing friends and loved ones. And so, but your humor then is not about the death. Your humor is not about the pandemic. Your humor is about the fear that people have. For instance, you can then weave a humor around the fact that somebody in a bus sneezes and everybody in the bus gets out of it. Gets off.
Let me tell you,
the bus.
I coughed in my own locked up apartment in LA, and our guest who was in Kigali, Rwanda, yesterday said, "Did you just cough?" I said, "Yes, in my own apartment on the other side of the world."
But you can't blame the person. Technology has gotten to the point where things can go from one place to the other easily. You could fax that to the guy. But you can't be too careful. In these days, you can't be too careful. One other thing. Let me tell you one thing. When it comes to, we understand what a normal church is like. Mm-hmm. You lay hands, you sit close to one another, you dance, you sweat. When you raise your voice and pray, the decibels with which you're singing and shouting and all of that, definitely saliva will be in the air.
Yes.
You understand? Why did you make your face like that? I'm far away from you.
I understand. Graphically, right. Thank you. I think you've made your point. Let me ask you, aside from killing certainly metaphorically reducing the numbers of people who want to go to church after this lockdown is over, Alibaba, your people are, again, like you said, people are finding humor in this moment and also doing things in a very uniquely Nigerian way. I've spent a lot of time in Nigeria. Like, for instance, I was reading the other day, and I saw that you have a designer who's making masks, but she's blinging them. She's blinging them out.
You know, we're a status-driven society. If you're selling anything, there are certain people who will not touch it unless you make it different and expensive. So if some people walk into a store and you say, "Oh, this pack of juice is 500 naira. But you see, this one here is 2,000 naira. You say, give me 2 of the 2,000 naira one." We're a status-driven society. And so a status-driven society would want to separate themselves from the common people. And so a lot of businessmen, like the person you're talking about, understands that. And so, which is the reason also that makes people say, pimp my ride. The car comes to you.
Pimp my mask.
Okay.
But listen,
exactly.
I think it's genius on the part of the designer, because they say you need to know your market. She looked, she said, "This is a society that likes bling. I'm going to bling some masks up." I'm not mad at her. I think that's pure genius.
Yes, it is. It is a response to the market.
The other thing I wanted to ask you your opinion on, because I know you have a lot of time at home to kind of, because you're locked down like the rest of us, to think about what's happening. So, Funke Akindele,
yes,
the Nollywood actress who threw a party during a lockdown, what and who was also in a number of, I believe, messages,
promotional campaign. Yes.
So tell me more. What do you make of this whole situation?
Okay, what I think is that it was an error of judgment, and she quickly realized that and apologized, but the deed was done. It was an error of judgment, especially with the fact that she was a brand ambassador. She was an ambassador helping to push the stay at home, keep social distances, wash your hands, and all of that. And she was a brand ambassador for one of the disinfectants.
I think Dettol.
One brand for
someone said Dettol.
Dettol, yes, Dettol, yes, Dettol. And so when you wear that kind of, when you're carrying that kind of brand on your shoulders, your actions should also depict the people that you represent. And she failed to do so, but she apologized immediately. But the deal was done. I think what the government also wanted to do was that the government did not want to just let it lie, because they wanted to prove a point that there were no sacred cows when this when it happened. They didn't want anybody to go away with the belief that because she's a celebrity, they let her get away with it, you know. So she was like a scapegoat. All right, but that is that. The important thing was that she did something wrong, and she's apologized, and she's been sentenced as well.
Yeah, I saw she was arraigned in court and had to pay a fine. So
but did you see the number of people who were trooping with her into the court?
No, I didn't see that. Wasn't everyone supposed to be on lockdown?
Exactly. There were over 30 people around her getting her to court. They should jail all of them as well.
So tell me, where are you drawing inspiration from right now? As you know, we have less than 2 minutes left, but I do want you to share where you're drawing inspiration for our viewers.
As a comedian, we watch people. People watching is one part of getting materials. The other is watching the reaction of people to things that happen in the society, and then we go online and begin to read. Trust me, when we come back after this coronavirus, there'll be a lot of materials that we're going to milk out from churches, milk out from political office holders, milk out from all the ladies that we now see their usual faces. You know. Okay, you don't need makeup. You don't need makeup. I shall come. You know what I'm talking about.
Don't mix me up.
People.
Don't mix me up.
Somebody. Okay, no. Not make it. Wait. Someone. This is true. A lady went to get some water from somewhere, and the man said, "Oh, your much younger sister is the one that normally comes to buy the water from us." And she said, "No, I'm the one that comes." She said, and so what happened? She took the water, left, and said she would never leave her house without making it. So there are materials that we're going to use. We're on the lockdown right now, and business is very bad, but we're online. We're online providing laughter as well.
Let me tell you, Alibaba, when this lockdown is over, not only will you not be able to go near a church, you will not be able to go near any women in that city who have heard you make those jokes about women. So you better lock yourself away in that house of yours. You'll be on lockdown from now till.
Well, I'll make it up. I'll make it up to them. I'll make it up.
You'd better. Alibaba, it was such a pleasure. Thank you for spending time with me and with my viewers and being the bright side and giving us lots to think about. I shall see whether I can find my own product to sell in Nigeria that I can bling out.
Especially makeup, yes.
Alibaba, please stay safe. Thank you again.
I will. Thank you so much. Yeah. Bye.
Bye. And I want to say thank you to you as well, that you take time out of your day, wherever you are, and hang out with me at home in LA, where I'm locked up and who knows for how long. There is no end in sight, but we will get through this. And every day at noon Pacific time, that is 3 p.m. if you're on the East Coast, that is 7 p.m. GMT, I will be right here with my beanie on, speaking to people from around the continent and around the world about what is happening in Africa when it comes to the spread of coronavirus. So thank you. Thank you for being part of the show. As always, please send your thoughts, send your messages, send your questions for our doctors so we can put them to them. Your voice is every bit as important as mine. You are the heartbeat of the show. This is all about community, all about us coming together and leaning on each other. So please, let's do that in the days ahead. Hope to see you back here tomorrow. Same time, same place. Be safe, everyone. Sending lots of love. Take care. Bye for now. Africa. Sing it.